Alright, welcome back to Jorbs Scribbles on the Screen and talks about everything in the Slay the Spire Compendium. Talking about Sword Boomerang right now. Sword Boomerang is a 1-cost common attack for Ironclad. It deals 3 damage to a random enemy 3 times, and it upgrades to 4. So, common attacks are often we sort of have the same thing to say about every single common attack. This is a card that you add to your deck early because you need to be able to deal more damage to kill an enemy like Gremlin Knob or kill Hexaghost before Hexaghost kills you. And then usually common attacks get less and less exciting later on in the game because there are just far more impressive ways to deal damage. Whether it's like a Limit Break or a Juggernaut with Exhaust synergies, or even just like relics like Mercury Hourglass start to deal a lot of damage compared to a common attack a lot of the time. But Sword Boomerang is slightly unique as a common attack that has incredibly good strength scaling. This actually has better strength scaling per energy, at least, than Heavy Blade does. So if you're playing a deck that can't draw that many cards and really want strength scaling, you probably want a Heavy Blade. But if you're drawing a deck that can draw a lot of cards, and maybe can get to scenarios where it's like playing an attack, then drawing cards, and playing the same attack again in the same turn, a card like Sword Boomerang gets pretty exciting with some strength scaling there. That said, this attack pays for its like late game potential with the fact that it's not really that great early a lot of the time. It's ironic that Lagavulin's on this card because this card isn't very good against Lagavulin. Lagavulin's strength down hits it 3 times as hard as it would for other cards. It's not very good against sentries either. You want to be able to target your damage in that fight, and this can't target its damage. And so taking the card early in Act 1 is a little bit harder than it is to take other early game common attacks. Unless you already have like an Inflame or a Spot Weakness, or you have a Strength Potion maybe, or you already have a Combust, so you're good at the fights where this card isn't that great. Those are all things to be looking for where it's like, okay, the downside of Sword Boomerang doesn't matter as much, so I can be picking up a Sword Boomerang here to round out my attacks, and maybe I'll have some potential out of that for later on in the game. It's worth noting that Guardian's whatever it's called, thorn-plated, it's not actually thorns that Guardian has, it's some other thing which hits you every time you play an attack, so this only actually gets hit once by Guardian's thorns. It doesn't get hit 3 times by Guardian's thorns, so it's a little bit better in the Act 1 boss fights because of that little mechanical thing. Being unable to target with it is absolutely a drawback, and so again, if you're good at the fights where that is a drawback, because you have a Whirlwind Plus or an Immolate or a Combust, you can take this a little bit more happily. And perhaps the only other interesting thing I have to say about Sword Boomerang in general is that this is one of the few common attacks where it actually makes quite a lot of sense to take it late game sometimes. Most common attacks, there's some point in the run where you're just literally never going to even bother reading the card when it's offered to you because that's just how common attacks work. But Sword Boomerang, if you've got enough strength scaling, this card can actually be added to your deck later in the run. And that's Sword Boomerang. Any questions? Electrobolt. Oh, for people who aren't watching in order, I guess, I'm joined by Electrobolt. Played a ton of Slay the Spire back in Ascension 15. Very good at strategy games. And just have him here to ask me questions and pry into how Ascension 20 Ironclad is working.
I'm here to learn from the master. Yeah, hey guys. So I think Sword Boomerang's a fairly simple card, and it's based on what you said, it functions exactly identical to how it functions in A15. I think the 2 interesting things to think about probably are Sword Boomerang in the first couple of floors before the first elite. How often are you, I guess, ever skipping it, or what kind of cards are you, like, what cards do you put, like, right at the threshold of, like, this card is barely better than Sword Boomerang on floor 1?
Sure, so, like, on floor 1, if I'm walking through 3 Holy Fights, 2 Question Marks, a Campfire, and then an Elite Fight, and I'm offered, like, Sword Boomerang versus Twin Strike,
Yeah.
I think is sort of the situation you're imagining.
Well, that's no, Twin Strike is way ahead of Sword Boomerang in that scenario.
Um,
Only kidding. That was the old joke.
I remember that collab run. Yeah, no, I
Yeah,
remember
yeah.
that one. Well, it deals 9 damage for 1 energy, and you definitely start each run of Slay the Spire with this, like, I would like to be able to kill Gremlin Knob before I die priority in your deck building. And 9 energy, or 9 damage for 1 energy is a lot more than what Strike does, and this also has upsides if you hit a Strength Potion or whatever. So if I haven't added enough damage to get through Gremlin Knob yet, I'm going to be picking Sword Boomerang over things that don't solve that problem in some other way. But if I'm offered like Perfected Strike versus Sword Boomerang, or Twin Strike versus Sword Boomerang, or even Iron Wave versus Sword Boomerang, at that point it starts getting messy and complicated, and it really depends on what other things are happening, how many elites I'm fighting, how strong a situation I'm in, stuff like that. The stronger situation I'm in, well, it depends even on the act path. If there are like 4 or 5 elites, I might want to take the card that's just better for Act 1 elites, even if I am already strong, because I want to like snowball through those elites, maybe try not to have to rest too many times and get some upgrades as well. If I'm in an act which is only like 3 campfires and 2 elites, I might just take the Sword Boomerang there because it's the card that has the higher like latent potential, I guess.
Right.
Especially if I've taken a combust already.
I think that's the key thing to be thinking about with Sword Boomerang, is because, like you said, it is a scaling attack that remains relevant into the late game. If you can afford to take it over an attack that doesn't scale but is better in the early game, you're inevitably making your deck stronger for the late game. So that's one of the interesting dynamics there.
Yeah, but there definitely are not many attacks that are worse than Sword Boomerang for the early game.
Right.
Unless you're like holding a Strength Potion already, or already have an Inflame.
Right. So following up on that question though, how often do you end up in an A20 run with strength scaling being your win condition for Ironclad? In other words, if I'm looking at trying to get this into my deck early over another attack, how often does it just end up as a useless card anyways in the late game?
Gotcha. I think I would break strength scaling into crazy stuff with limit break, which I think happens quite rarely. Maybe 5 to 10% of wins. And more reasonable stuff with other things going on. Like the deck just sort of like has a spot weakness and an Inflame, but it also blocks with Corruption, Feel No Pain. And so it's like the damage exists in the deck, but it's a little bit messy and not very fine-tuned and channeled. And I think that happens quite often.
I was going to say, I think having 1 limit break and 1 spot weakness is like an institution for Ironclad. That's just like a thing.
I think limit break's a lot worse than I used to think limit break was. Limit break is one of those cards where the better you get at winning close runs, the more you realize you don't need it.
Interesting. Do you want to expand on that a little bit?
So say you're not very good at building Ironclad decks and don't understand which potions to buy in order to survive turn 2 and 3 of the Act 4 fights and stuff like that. You may need very, very strong decks in order to power through and win those runs. And so being able to pop off with Limit Break and get 50 strength may be something that you need far more often than how the game feels once you do learn, like, exactly the limits of your deck. You can have a Gambler's Brew and this card draw relic, and it's going to let you very consistently get to this particular power, which is vital for surviving the Act 4 Elite fight or the Act 4 Heart fight, and so now you're protected from one bad draw, sorts of things. The more and more that I've gotten better at that, the more, like, decks with 5 to 10 strength are decks that I'm winning with, and the less I'm, like, having to bother going to 20 plus strength with the Limit Break.
And would you say the main advantage in that is that you're both saving gold from not buying it in the store and then also occasionally taking other cards over it? Is that...
Well, it's also just not a very good card on turn 1.
Right. Okay. So you're even.
So you're winning yourself a card draw for early turns by not having a limit break a lot of the time.
Yeah, that's true. Do you still feel the way if you say had a Gira with 3 innate starting strength?
I think it would be pretty hard to not be taking a limit break at that point. But at that point,
Right.
like, limit break's the same as spot weakness. So,
Right.
you know.
Interesting.
Um,
So I would assume that means you never take any naked limit breaks anymore, right?
I don't remember the last time that I took a limit curse. Yeah. That
Okay,
was
interesting.
that was something I did a lot more a long time ago. It's something that I don't do nearly as much anymore.
Okay, because yeah, back when I played, that was something that I remember seeing you do a bunch of, and I definitely experimented with it.
I think
Okay,
that was like a time when, if we're talking about Ascension 15 all the way back there, Ironclad could easily win more than 90% of Ascension 15 runs.
Yeah.
And a loss condition for Ironclad in the like 1 in 20 runs that you did lose was just not getting enough scaling for like beating the champ or something.
Yeah, the champ really was A15 was so interesting because it really just broke down to like Knob, champ, and then like the orb walkers. That was like the entire game.
Sometimes I think Collector could kill you too if you got a like bad draw against Collector. But I think the Act 2 boss fight scaling was a big deal, and if you could scale for the Act 2 boss fight, it was very hard to not manage to kill the Act 3 boss. And so taking a limit break at the end of Act 1 there makes a ton of sense, because you're going to be strong enough for other problems in the game to be carrying around this card that doesn't do anything, and all of a sudden you widen your solution space for the Act 2 boss from, you know, building an entire scaling engine on its own to all you have to do is find a strength potion now. One strength potion wins the fight because you double the strength twice, and there you go.
Cool. So tying everything back together then, with this new framing on the importance of strength with Ironclad, how do you think that affects the importance of getting a card like Sword Boomerang compared to like at A15?
That's really hard for me to answer.
I could have probably come up with a simpler question.
Well, yeah.
I
don't remember Sword Boomerang being very important at Ascension 15 in general.
Yeah.
If you had that limit break or whatever, you're going to be fine. But
Right.
I do think that in the messy environment where you are having to add powerful things to your deck that don't necessarily all line up and do exactly the same thing together, Sword Boomerang works a little bit better, because you do end up taking a spot weakness even if you're not going to win with that spot weakness somewhat often. On the other hand, it's hard to take this card at the beginning of Act 1 sometimes if you're being offered other better damage commons for Act 1 over it.
Gotcha.
Alright, well that was Sword Boomerang.